Today's episode is with Cody McBroom. Cody is the CEO and head coach of Tailored Coaching Method, where he and his team pride themselves on helping average individuals achieve and maintain above average results through world-class individualization, education, and connection. Cody has been a pioneer in the nutrition and training world, and I've personally learned a ton from him over the years, so I'm super excited to have him on the show today. So in this episode, we're going to be chatting all about the hierarchy of a successful transformation and why it matters. Cody's also going to explain his experience with clients in the realm of body recomposition. And we're also going to discuss the concept of diet dials and how Cody uses these in his coaching practice. We also chat about the benefits of carbohydrates, tracking macros, and the importance of incorporating different forms of cardio and conditioning into your training plan and why that matters depending on your goal. So lots of things to dive into today, and I really enjoyed this conversation with Cody, and I know you're going to love it too. So let's get right into the episode. All right, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and I'm here with Cody McBroom. What's up, Cody? How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. I've been an admirer from afar for a while of your podcast. I love all the stuff that you're putting out. I've learned a lot from you over the years, and I'm really excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you. Well, that means a lot coming from you, especially, and it's always fun to podcast with other podcasters because it's a more formal and professional conversation. You know what I mean? So it's fun.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, for sure. So do you want to, before we get into, we have a bunch of topics. We're kind of joking off air how I had like a whole list of things I want to talk to. We'll probably get through like a quarter of them. But before we jump into some topics, do you want to just give our listeners a little background on who you are and how you got into the nutrition and fitness industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to not make it a long-winded story, but essentially, I was kind of always the chubbier kid in my group and in my family. My family's actually all really lean and small, except me. I was always like the black sheep, so I'm taller than all of them, and I was heavier than all of them. And I was just always that way. And it wasn't until I had a couple injuries in high school soccer. Soccer is actually what got me more active and started losing a little bit of weight. Then I tore my meniscus playing soccer, had surgery, gained some weight, came back the next year to play, did not rehab properly, tore my ACL in the same knee, which sent me back down the same path. So I ended up graduating high school with no real drive. And I had a bunch of friends going and playing college ball, and I just kind of stayed home, partied, and didn't really do anything. And it wasn't until I was 18, had graduated at 17, that I actually stepped foot in the gym and started training. Like I literally was out of it for that long until I was out of high school, which drove me down a path of trying to fix my knee the wrong way and then getting really into bodybuilding, honestly, in different types of training. Eventually, I met up with a guy that was the director of the fitness program at my school. I was going to school for business, and I just fell in love with his class. The first class I attended was actually because I was skipping one of my classes to jump in. And it was called functional movement. And it was, I mean, he had a picture of a baby on the projector doing a quadruped crawl. And he had all these lines around it that he was like explaining the movement patterns and the posture. And it was just like blowing my mind. And this was at a time when functional movement meant standing on a Bosu ball while doing things. And he was kind of educating people on what it really meant, you know? And so that's pushed me down a path to start actually training with some more of a methodical approach, skipping classes a lot to attend his, and eventually deciding to change my degrees, which oddly enough, both my parents said no to because they were paying for college. But I actually went and forged my dad's signature and did it anyway. And so ended up switching degrees. They later on were totally fine with it because they saw my passion. And went through school, started interning for somebody I met there, met a whole bunch of people in the industry through the college professor that I was with there. Really big names that would come speak: Charlie Weingroff, Dan John, Michael Boyle, Eric Cressy, Greg Cook, so many people that were just legends in the space. And I ended up interning at a strength facility called Vigor Ground, which is a pretty well-known gym out here in Seattle. For that to be my first place to work out was a pretty cool opportunity. And I learned a ton and actually trained people there for 6.5 years while writing blogs and creating free content on every platform I could get my hands on and just trying to educate people for free until a couple of people started asking me to program for them, and they were in New York or in Texas, across the country. And so I said yes. I charged them through PayPal and was like, this could be a thing. And I went down that path. Um, so long story short, I ended up quitting the gym job, giving up all my clients, starting my online business, which then was Boom Boom Performance, because my nickname has always been Cody Boom Boom. And I started just building it and from the ground up, really. And at a certain point, I got too busy, hired an assistant, hired a coach, then hired another coach, and it just kind of kept snowballing and growing, all organically. And eventually, I decided to change the name to Tailored Coaching Method, which describes what we do much better. Boom Boom Performance doesn't describe anything that we did at all. So I changed the name because it was just becoming more than just me, and now we have 9 coaches plus me. I still coach, not as many clients as I used to, but I still do coach. We have a marketing and media guy full time, our operations lady, our assistant. We have a chief science officer, Dr. Brandon Roberts, who is, he's a fitness and nutrition researcher, but he's also our team educator and chief science officer. And we're just growing. We're an online coaching company, mainly nutrition, which is what I ended up shifting more into after my first bodybuilding show years back. And mainly just because, and you might relate to this a little bit, and I know a lot of trainers do, when you're a trainer at a gym and everybody just does training, it's nice to go down a different path to stand out. And so I actually went the nutrition route because I was the only trainer who was also a certified nutritionist, and then became the most popular coach because I was the only one who could take people through diets properly,
Yeah.
But then I just realized, that's people's biggest struggle. And so we kind of shifted that way to scale the company because we felt like it was a better suit. And that's what we do today, is mainly nutrition coaching and some training along with all the free content we put out.
That's awesome. I love it. So speaking of taking people through diets properly, like you just mentioned, so there's something that you talk about a lot in terms of like the hierarchy of importance when it comes to just overall transformation. Whether that's people focusing specifically on body composition, and kind of realizing that it's a lot more than just the nutrition and the training. Can you talk a little bit about like what you see the hierarchy being for transformation, and what like a successful transformation looks like in terms of not just, getting to the goal, but being able to sustain that goal afterwards?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, kudos to Eric Helms. I think he kind of pioneered the whole hierarchy idea. And what he put out with that taught me a ton in the coaching space, and everything he does teaches me so much. He's such a knowledgeable researcher, but his hierarchy was always, he had behavior and habits. I think it's habits and behavior change or something, or lifestyle underneath the pyramid. So it wasn't even included in the pyramid, but it was kind of like a small point, like, hey, you got to be ready for this from an environment lifestyle perspective before you jump into it. But then it was just, calories, macros, micros, meal timing, and then supplements. And from a theoretical and an on paper perspective, that makes complete sense. I 100% agree with it. But the more I got into coaching and the longer I was here in this space, the more I realized that you almost can't categorize it perfectly that way with everybody. I think that the behavior, the lifestyle, the environment, the psychology of dieting and body composition change, that actually should be included in the pyramid. It's not just like a quick prerequisite of like, hey, you should think about it, but let's talk about calories. I think it should be almost mandatory. And I think a lot of times when people come to us, they've already accomplished that. They've already tried to diet. They've already consumed so much free content. So sometimes we don't have to worry about it, but it's to make a good point on it. And then throughout the rest of the pyramid, I think things are interchangeable. There's times where I think mealtime is actually extremely important because of stress levels or digestion, or even the fact that they can't adhere to their calorie intake if we don't dial in their meal timing according to their lifestyle schedule and work schedule and training schedule. You know what I mean? So there's times where those things are more important, or if somebody is hitting their macros, but they just eat like shit, for lack of better terms, we might need to focus more on micros because they need micronutrients to feel better. And again, adhere to the diet or get the macros to work for them long term. So I just want to preface that everybody's individual. And even if I try to categorize this, which I'm going to, in a general setting for most people, there's always situations where we can kind of flip-flop it around and shift things within this hierarchy or pyramid. But first and foremost, I do think that the behavior, lifestyle, environment, that needs to be in the pyramid. That's the first thing, because there's a psychology associated with body composition change, self-discipline, even just grit. I think there's a lot of people with the flexible dieting movement who don't necessarily take it too far, because I'm a big proponent of that. I like our clients to be able to adhere to the diet, and I think flexible dieting is the best route to do that. But I also think that we need to prioritize eating real food, and we need to also let people know that, hey, it's not always easy. Flexible dieting sounds very, very easy. If Fit Your Macros sounds very, very easy, and you can just do whatever you want. And the diet it should be stress-free, should be super simple. Whereas I take the approach of like, hey, we want to make this as simple as possible, as little stressful as possible. But the reality is there's going to be times where it's hard. If you've ever gone through a serious cut or a prep or any fat loss phase, there's days you just don't want to do it. So how can we teach people to set up their lifestyle, their environment, their habits, the people around them, public accountability? So not even accountability to your coach, but also, hey, does your spouse know that you're doing this? Like, do your friends know that you're doing this? Because if you're hiding the diet, when you go out to a social setting, you're not going to even consider or follow the diet at all. Now, we can make it flexible to enjoy those settings, but you got to also let them know that you're doing this so they support you, and you don't give into peer pressure simply because you don't want to admit that you're on a diet, which for whatever reason is, I don't know if it's embarrassing for people, it's hard for people. And I get it. I did it at one point in time too, but until I just looked at my friends and was like, hey, I'm doing this for me because I want to change. I don't like the way I look. They cared about me. Nobody was like, come on, man, don't do that. Everybody was supportive of it. But this kind of all falls into that environment, lifestyle, behavior change, psychology, which is a big emphasis for us. It's not an official book club, but all the coaches on my team, we have kind of like a book club where we're always reading a book together. We also have somebody who is almost done with her master's in psychology. And it's really helpful for us to keep that at the forefront, because how we talk to people, how we look at people's lifestyle, the way we communicate and the way we make adjustments, all those things matter just as much as calories, because the calories won't work if you don't consider this factor first. And I think that's pretty important in this transformation hierarchy. After that, I do think, calories, macros, they come next. Micros are very important. Meal timing is very important. And sometimes we flip flop around, but like Eric Helms pyramid, you have to be in a caloric deficit to drop weight. There's times where we can get around this for recomp, and I think we might talk about that today. But for the most part, energy balance, we can't ignore it, right? And macros are the way to individualize that. And then the small things come after that. Now, if we implement training in supplementation, all those, it's hard for me to say whether or not in this priority or this order of importance, nutrition or training comes first. I hate the idea of 80-20, like it's 80% nutrition and 20, because the training is the stress that builds muscle. It's the stress that creates strength. It's going to build just as much, if not more, work ethic, discipline. The amount of endorphins and hormonal releases that you have from training, and just positive moods and motivation and all those kind of things that come from it, play into nutrition. So I think it's very 50-50. I think if you're brand new, just getting in the gym and lifting, moving, doing anything, don't worry about volume, intensity, and all the nitty gritty stuff. And then calories and macros, and then eventually after that, that's when we start to periodize the two of them. And then after that, we can start focusing on nutrient timing, supplementation, things of that nature. Now, I could probably do a whole podcast just on this one topic, but does that kind of like summarize what pretty well?
No, yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. Basically what you're saying is that everybody is an individual, right? And so everybody's coming from a different starting place, right? And so this pyramid is kind of like the overarching, like what matters kind of most in general for most people. But it kind of depends, like you said, like where you're starting off at, and what, like if you're coming in to, if I'm working with a client and they're coming to me from already working with a previous coach, maybe they've already, been training for years, they already have their nutrition on point, like all of that, they're coming in at a different spot versus someone who's like, I've never tracked my calories before, or, I still have all these other kind of environmental lifestyle things to deal with before, like you said, macros, they still matter before they can actually work for you. So no, I think you summed that up very well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do want to get into the recomposition a little bit. So this is kind of a question I have for you in terms of, body recomposition and kind of this newer word called maingaining. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, I have. Or gaintaining.
Yeah, like there's so many different words for all this stuff now. But I was just curious because, we hear a lot about, the more advanced you are, the harder it is to recomp, right? And when we say recomp, we just like losing body fat and building muscle at the same time. or basically just changing your body composition for whatever your goal is. So based off of kind of your experience working with, hundreds, thousands of people, what have you seen in terms of body recomposition for, is it really only for people who are new to training or who are coming back from training? Or do you feel like there is still some kind of runway for people who are more advanced, or maybe they are more elite? Does that question kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
I do think so. I think it is possible for a lot of different people. Now, I think this part we can kind of just chip away easily. If you come back from injury, so I tore my meniscus again in 2019, so third time. Second time for meniscus, third knee injury, but I had surgery. And I saw recomp after that because I actually did measurements. I did DEXAs and all that stuff because I'm a geek. And I lost like 2 inches on my quad and my hamstring on that one side from being, surgery, post-surgery, all that stuff. And I couldn't train for 2 to 3 months. My legs at all. I could sit in a chair and do curls and presses as best as I could. But I saw a recomp after that for sure. Because what did I do when I started training again? I increased volume by 150% probably. And then I also went into a surplus mainly via carbohydrates. Like, a lot of that was muscle memory, but from a visual perspective, or if I did a DEXA, it looks like a recomp, right? And then somebody who's new. We've all coached the people that are brand new to lifting and they want to like lose fat or they're skinny fat, and we see a huge recomp. It's awesome. Now, I think if you haven't had Chris Barakat on, or if you don't know who that is, good friend of mine down in Florida. Have you had him on before?
Yeah, he came on a while ago. Yeah.
So I met him in 2000. I think 15 or 16 at Physique Summit, like way before either of us were doing much of what we're doing today. So I've known him for a long time, and he's done a lot of cool recomp stuff and even some research. So it's nice to see him coming out and showing it's possible in advanced individuals. I think where it's most common, there's kind of like, there's 3 scenarios in my opinion. One of the scenarios is if we see a dramatic change in the way people are going about something. So I've seen this with the CrossFitter who has been CrossFitting and they look good. I mean, they're in great shape, but they've been CrossFitting for their whole training career. They've never done anything but that. And maybe they're burnt out, maybe they have injuries, whatever it is. They come on board and I shift their diet a little bit and I drive their volume up through bodybuilding training. We see a recomp. If somebody was doing primarily Olympic lifting and we change it, we'd see a recomp. I've even seen in the opposite where somebody has done bodybuilding for a long time and we make a huge shift to something they've never done and we see a recomp, or somebody that is doing Orange Theory Fitness or circuit training and we do this, right? So training age, I think, and training experience are 2 different things, but just because your training age is long doesn't mean that you can't see a recomp. And there was only one study I'm aware of that has shown this, and I think Greg Knuckles reviewed it in Mass one time. And they took Olympic lifters and put them on a bodybuilding program. And they took bodybuilders and did something with them. And the only group that saw a recomp or muscle growth extremely fast was the Olympic lifters. And it was just because they've never bodybuilded before. They've been doing Olympic lifting for 3, 4, 5 years and then shifted. So I think shock the muscle is an old non-scientific bro term. But if we consider shocking the muscle after years of doing the same thing, it might actually cause some of this, right? The other case is really, really dialed in training, nutrition, supplementation. So and a lot of patience, really, that would be the third thing, but it'd be kind of a combination. So there are times where if somebody commits to a full year and we're at maintenance calories and we're trying to gaintain or main gain or whatever we want to call it, I do think we can see that. You got to start out pretty lean and you would have to find your maintenance calories, stay there for a good, 2 to 4 weeks to make sure that you're at maintenance, you're not gaining or losing. And then from there, maybe we implement some intra-workout carbs, which there is some good literature on like mouth swooshing of carbohydrate solutions. And there's also some literature that, rest in peace to Mountain Dog, that he used to promote quite a bit. Some of the research showing highly branched cyclic dextrin and essential amino acids during your workout to blunt cortisol and build more muscle. So there's a little bit there. And that's like that 1%, maybe 5% difference that most people don't need to worry about. But if we're talking about recomp for an advanced individual, that's the person that would utilize this, right? So if we dial in that the rest of their supplementation between multivitamins and fish oil, all the way to creatine and caffeine consumption, your sleep, maybe even consider chrononutrition and the meal timing and all these different factors. You're doing some aerobic training to stay lean, but you're doing enough volume to grow. and you're ready to just move at a snail pace. Again, like you go through a year of that, you're going to build muscle. It's just very slow. So I think the truth about recomp is most people either have to be a brand new beginner or just recently injured, or you have to be unbelievably patient. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that if this is your lifestyle. If this is your lifestyle, then why not? If you don't want to go through the cuts and bulks, if you like to stay generally lean, I do think there's value in that. And I think it can be possible. It just takes a lot of dialing in on all these little tiny details until you get to that goal. And then of course, there's also, people got to remember too, if you see a before and after of a recomp, you got to always wonder what the dates are, because sometimes people will show a recomp or a reverse diet or anything like that, and it's 2 years apart, 1 year apart. And I even have before and afters like this. And I try to explain like, hey, we went through a full fat loss phase and then a lean gaining phase, right? Or we went through a gaining phase and then a fat loss phase. And, we can see this recomp because we went through multiple phases of dieting before getting there. And that's really ultimately, even for myself, I spent all of half of 2019 to 2020, so a full year with Eric Trexler, just trying to build as much muscle I can. I'm going to be 30 next year. I was like, let me just try like to go through a serious gaining phase. We put on like 16 pounds. So it was really successful. And then I went through a cut, and now I'm not as lean as I could be, but I'm leaner than I've ever been at this weight. Right. I technically recomped, but it took 2 years. You know what I mean? Because I went through the phases. So there's that as well.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like we have a lot of similarities. I actually just went through my first like 8-month bulk during that time, or build bulk, whatever you want to call it. And now this is kind of a selfish question, because now I'm at a point where I'm actually just finishing a cut now. And I just want to kind of see what the next like year, just maintaining or at maintenance, and see what I can do there. But I do work with a lot of females, and it is very hard to convince females to go into a surplus. Is that something that you deal with a lot too?
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say, I'd have to really look to find a percentage, but I would say we work with 60 to 70% women. And I don't think that's necessarily because we just market to women. I think women are more open to coaching than men. Unfortunately, I think a lot of men are, I'm a guy and I'm going to say it, that a lot of guys that lift are egotistical and they think they can do it themselves. You can't, you need help. But, women are typically more open, and that's something we go through a lot. We have a lot of content about muscle growth for women and stuff like that, because we see it all the time. And we even see this, and you probably see this too, where they think they need weight loss and maybe they need some fat loss, but they're so attached to the scale and losing weight that by the time we lose that weight, they get there and they're like, oh, this isn't what I thought it would be. This isn't what I thought I would look like. And shit, I can even say that I did that when I first started my journey. I lost 40 to 50 pounds, and I was doing boot camps and high intensity circuits. And then I got there and I was like, I just kind of look skinny now. Like, what the heck? And I had to go research and understand, like, oh, I got to build muscle to look like what I thought I was going to look like. And the same applies to women. They just, it's a harder concept for them to grasp, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I feel like it's harder to, actually see that. And for me, like just working through it, like watching the scale go up, I said we were similar because I gained 15 pounds too during my building phase. I'm actually already back down to what I was starting, or a few pounds over what I was starting. And I can already, like you said, see a little bit of difference at a little bit of a higher body weight. But that was like I think it was like 8 to 9 months. And so I think one of the biggest things for me convincing my clients to if we want to go through a building phase is like, it's got to be a minimum like 6 months, or else you're just kind of going to continue to spin your wheels there. But I do have another question that just popped into my head. So a lot of my listeners are coming from the keto low carb space, which is where I personally came from when I first got into the industry. And you were talking about carbs a little bit, intra-workout carbs, things like that. Can you just kind of give our listeners like just a rundown of like, what are the benefits of carbohydrates if you are trying to change your body composition and build muscle? Can you just maybe give us a little convincing rundown? Because I think we need it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot. I think that and when I say these things, I want everybody to know I'm not against low carb diets by any means. I'm not even against keto diets. It's all context specific. I think that low carb and keto diets are great for far less people than the media makes us believe, because it's a very sexy thing to talk about in marketing, and it's sellable. It's very sellable. You can even sell like low carb or keto snacks and bars and supplements stuff. Like, you can't do that. Like, here's a high carb snack. Like, you know what I mean? Maybe endurance
Yeah.
athletes like that, but
Yeah.
the reality is there's quite a few things. For one, insulin has been made out to be like the boogeyman, and there's definitely scenarios where we do need to be careful with this, right? And we don't want to encourage over elevation of insulin, especially if somebody has insulin resistance, of course, in obese individuals and things like that. But there's also been a lot of research that shows if you're in a calorie deficit, you can reduce and prevent insulin resistance. If you lose body fat from a calorie deficit, even more so. If you exercise, even more so. And that's why studies with like the rice experiment, where their whole diet was rice, and I wouldn't recommend this. It was like 80% carbs from rice, 5% from 5 to 10% from like fruit juice extracts so they can get some vitamins and minerals, and then 10% protein. There's just no fats. I don't recommend this, people, but on average they lost 180 pounds, 160 pounds. It was in obese individuals. They weren't training, maybe walking. It's by Dr. Walter Kemper, I think. Really, really fascinating. But it goes to show, like, all these health markers improved on a very high carb diet. Does that mean you should always have high carbs and only eat carbs? No, it's to prove a point of insulin is not always the issue behind obesity. And I think if we look at muscle growth, insulin can actually be a helpful thing because it quite literally shuttles nutrients. And that's the problem with some people who have this resistance or who don't train or have muscle. It could be shuttling nutrients to the wrong area, fat storage, right? Whereas if we're storing it in the muscle cell, it's obviously a good thing. There's also the benefits of insulin having that inverse relationship with cortisol. So when we consider cortisol as a catabolic hormone and just something that kind of keeps people's stress levels elevated if you have a lot going on, which everybody listening to this, if you're paying attention to the news, if you have a job, if you have a family, you probably got stress in your life. It's life. So carbohydrates can spike insulin, that can blunt cortisol and actually help you manage elevated cortisol levels if that's an issue. Speaking of cortisol levels post-workout and during a workout, that's going to break down muscle tissue. It's going to break down aminos. Like, that's a good thing to have happen. There's also some research that it influences growth hormone, that it increases amino acid uptake into the bloodstream. So there's a lot of things that could be beneficial. And I definitely don't recommend this ever, but and nor am I a coach that understands how these things work, because I'm not a PED guy or coaching that stuff. But professional bodybuilders inject insulin into their body to get more jacked and more lean. So if they're taking exogenous insulin, which is very dangerous, so don't do it. But I'm just saying, like, that just should prove a point that, maybe we don't need to be worried about it always. Again, always being the key factor. The other thing is that muscle glycogen is quite literally carbohydrate. So if we want to fill our muscle with fuel and glycogen, which is going to make up the most of our tissue, and it's going to allow us to pull more water and sodium, creatine, all these things into the tissue to let it perform and recover better, which is going to lead to more growth. We need to fill it with something, which is carbohydrates, and we do know that carbohydrates are going to be the primary fuel source for basically everything in our body. There is a lot of data that shows, technically carbohydrates and glucose are the brain's main fuel source, but I think it's obvious now that if you can get through that transition, I think being in keto, it can work just as well for brain function. That's a fact. And there's even, reasons to intermittent fast for that reason, with adrenaline, cortisol levels being higher in the morning. If you're fasting, you might actually have more alertness and productivity if you're smart with managing it. So there's a lot there, but for muscle and for energy for your body to move and lift and perform, it's carbohydrates. It's primarily carbohydrates. And the nice thing about carbs as well is it is harder to store carbs as fat. And I know it's a very controversial thing to say. We actually me and my CSO just did a research review on this topic. And there's actually a breakdown of percentage. And I can't remember the exact percentage, so I'm not going to blurt it out here, but there is a percentage difference of likelihood of storage as fat versus glycogen or being burned off. And because the fuel source for training and activity is carbs, less carbs are likely to be stored as fat. So in the body composition world of fat loss and muscle growth, there's a lot of research that shows a high carb, low fat diet can actually be a pretty optimal approach for changing your physique, building muscle, burning fat. We get into murky waters when people take the fat too low, and we have issues with hormonal balance, health, even just flexibility. I mean, you can take your fats pretty low if your calories aren't too crazy low, because obviously low calories are what's going to cause the bulk of hormonal and metabolic adaptations versus one macro being too low. However, if anybody here has done the low threshold of fat, I want to say our CSO was a part of this paper, but so was Eric Helms, Trexler, Fishin, of some bodybuilders, and it was a bodybuilder case study experiment. And they basically saw how low they can pull fats, and they did like low carb versus high carb bodybuilding prep. And I want to say the low end they came up with was 0.5 grams per kilogram, which is really low. Like for me, that's like 40 grams of fat for where my weight is, which is pretty damn low. And even if I could maintain health with that, it's just hard. Like I said, my favorite food to you is steak. I can't even barely eat steak with that, you know? So the flexibility and adherence comes in. So we don't need to go that low, but I think there is a lot of evidence to point in the direction of higher carb, lower fat approaches working really well for managing stress, building muscle, fueling performance. And again, just the fact that they have to go through this process, de novo lipogenesis, to store as fat on the body as a lipid. And I mean, if we just look at it like, well, it's a carb, so it has to go through some transfer or some kind of process to change from a carb to a lipid, just be stored as fat versus a fat is already a fat. It's probably going to be easier. We're probably going to be beneficial. And the last thing I'll say real quick is that for anybody listening saying, you know, well, I read something about keto burns more fat, or most of the research on that is because if you're consuming more fat, you're definitely going to show more fat burning on a study because you're consuming more of it. It's the same reason why if you have a high carb diet, it's going to show you're burning more carbs. Neither one of those necessarily mean one or the other is better for fat loss. There's other things to look at for fat loss. Both of those just show whatever you consume the most of, you're going to burn more of that. If you only consumed protein, you know, you're going to be a protein burner, which none of us want to be, but it's kind of just, what are you giving yourself to use?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, all the points you had on are absolutely love them. And I think that one of the biggest things, like you just ended on in terms of fat oxidation versus actually fat burning, I think that's one of the most confusing things that a lot of people just don't understand because they're just not educated on, or maybe like they Google something and it's like all these things pop up, and that's why we don't Google things and without any context. So, but yeah, I think that's one of there's a lot of like kind of misinformation and misconceptions around, you know, keto and all of that. And I think a lot of it just comes down to like lack of education. And also just like a little bit, like you said, a little bit of kind of fear mongering and like it's sexy and it's like the cool thing to do or whatever. So yeah, I think you explained that very well. I do want to chat a little bit about periodization because I know you're big on that. I've gotten into that a lot with my clients over the years. I, you know, go through it myself in terms of finding success with that versus what I was doing before, which was CrossFit and low carb keto, and I was just kind of burnt myself out there. So I think periodization is super important. I think that's also one of the things a lot of people don't think about when it comes to transformation and changing their body composition, right? We always kind of think about the short term, like what's going to happen, you know, a month from now. Like we're kind of so focused on that versus being focused on like, okay, let's look at a year from now and kind of reverse engineer what we're doing and see, you know, what is going to get me to my goal, but then also allow me to sustain that, you know, for the long term. So in terms of periodization in that sense, when it comes to like nutrition, I know you posted this, I think it was last week. I saw a post about the 3 diet dials. And so in terms of like periodizing say going into a fat loss phase, right? There's different ways that you can go about that in terms of like intensity, duration. Can we just chat a little bit about that and kind of what you found to be, I guess, most optimal in your coaching practice for your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I definitely didn't make this up, but I like to believe I made it popular, more popular, and really try to push it in like the coaching space for Gen Pop, because I've done a bodybuilding show. I've coached people through bikini preps and bodybuilding preps. I've worked with some higher level CrossFit athletes and even just some different types of athletes, lower level mixed martial arts, things like that. And periodization is always a big factor because it's like, okay, well, when is your season or your competitions or your prep start, finish, postseason, preseason, off season, you know, there's all these different things we have to consider. And then we have Gen Pop people and they just don't even consider any of it. Yet we still have vacations. We have higher work, like depending on your job, there's certain seasons of the year that are really high demand and stress, travel, there's holidays, I mean, summer period, you know, camping, all these different things. So being able to periodize, even a diet break is considered periodization. So looking ahead and looking at that. And then as far as training, it's just a matter of saying like, well, what's next? You know, and I always found it fascinating that people didn't think about that. There was all these 4-week programs, and I mean, shit, I used to work at a gym that did Groupon. So we'd have people do a Groupon, and then they disappear for a couple months, come back losing the results they gained, and then do another Groupon for a boot camp. And it just drove me crazy and started kind of pushing me down this individualized path. But ultimately, I think that what I found was that not enough regular people were considering periodization from a standpoint of social events, stress, and then also using these dials to make sure that we're sustaining the result. You know, we always tell people when they come aboard, it's like, hey, I want to work with you as long as I possibly can. Don't get me wrong. Like, we're a coach. We want to continue to do business with you. And two, we want to continue to help you. This is what we love doing. And there's nothing easier and more fun than working with a client who, I shouldn't say more fun, because getting somebody started is a lot of fun too. But you know, a client's been with you for 6, 7, 8 months and they're just rolling with the punches. They get it. They're enthusiastic. It's lifestyle. And it's like, this is awesome. You know, we don't want you to leave, but at the same time, we tell you at the front end, our goal is to get you to the result first and foremost. And then second, is to teach you what the hell we're doing along the way so that you can leave and go continue to sustain your results rather than fall off, regain the weight. And then you come back to us, right? And we have to do it again. Or we see you and run it and we're like, we would never say this, but like, damn, you fell off, right? Like we want you to be able to sustain that. So these dials kind of help us do that. And it's funny because I've used these dials in my coaching for years, and I've talked about it with clients, my coaches. And then I said it just recently on a research review, and our CSO was like, dude, I love that analogy. You need to do content on that. And I was like, yeah, I guess I never have. It's pretty good. But essentially the way I look at it is there's 2 ways to use these dials. The one way is what we're talking about. When somebody comes aboard, how are we going to periodize? And looking at both adherence and personality, what are they going to work best with? And then also, what do we think from a physiological perspective is going to work best with them, their body, right? What are they going to respond best to? But then on the other side, it's part of the assessment. So it's what I'm asking you. You come to me and you're like, and you probably get this too, like, I've tried it all, quote unquote, right? I'm ready. And so like in my mind, I'm immediately going, okay, you've dieted before, if not already right now, you're trying to. So how long have you been dieting for? Duration, right? How many times have you dieted in the last year? Frequency. How hard or aggressive were the diets that you went through? Intensity, right? And now I have intensity, frequency, duration to determine for me, can I even put them into a diet at the beginning? Or do they need a reverse? Do they need a maintenance phase? Do we need to ease into this because their frequency and intensity, which is pretty common, has been all the way cranked up. They go super hard. It doesn't last long. And then they fall off. They wait a couple weeks, then they try it again. And so I know you've done this many times aggressively. And now I'm going to say, hey, we're going to take it slow and do a long duration, turn down the dial of intensity and frequency, right? And it's the same thing as volume, intensity, frequency with training. If you go to the gym, you write a program and you turn your intensity way up. So you're doing heavy 1-rep maxes, 80 to 100% on everything you do. And you turn your volume up, you're doing tons of sets per muscle group per week. And then you turn your frequency up and you're hitting every muscle 3 times a week, training 7 days. You're going to burn out, right? And that's obvious. The same thing with diet, right? You can only sustain it for so long. So it's kind of determining how we jump into the diet. And then when I get somebody started, it's going into it from a perspective of like, hey, we have these 3 dials. What do you think? Right. And this is some like motivational interviewing stuff, which is a fantastic book and philosophy of communicating with clients. What do you think you would work best with? Because now I'm empowering them to make a decision instead of me telling them what to do, which is always going to lead to better adherence. I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that they choose the one I want them to choose, you know, and if they don't, then I'm going to manipulate it the best way possible. Instead of turning intensity up until they fall off, I'm going to say, when you died in the past, you would make it 4 or 5 weeks. So we're only going to go hard for 3 weeks. Then we're going to take a 2-week diet break. And that's our intensity and frequency dial being a little bit more moderately up, right? Now, if we look at a bikini prep, intensity's way up, frequency's down, duration's down, 12 to 20 weeks max, dieting hard, very aggressive, getting after it. So we can look at these dials like, well, let's turn intensity up halfway, let's turn frequency up a little bit, and we're going to keep duration down. Shorter, moderately aggressive diets more frequently until we get to the goal, kind of like a Matador approach, right? Which has its flaws, but there's different ways to spin it. I think the key context of Matador is deficit, diet break. How long each is dependent on the individual and the situation. But and then the other side of it is duration. You know, we can diet for 24 weeks if we want to, but we're just gonna like have intensity pretty low, frequency is basically off, and duration is way the hell up. So we're just coasting, we're going slow. But this determines our periodization, right? And now we can say, if it is duration, how long is it going to be? 12, 16, 20, 24 weeks? Is there refeeds or diet breaks in there for psychological purposes? Because it's probably the only reason you'll need those. Are we doing this from a frequency perspective, intensity perspective? And there's times where you can dial multiple up, even in the sense of, speaking of the Matador study, I think the flaw there, or with most diet break research, is that the longest diet break people are taking is typically like 2 weeks in a study. And from what I've talked to our CSO, and he's kind of picked people's brains on metabolic adaptation, looking at the research, most metabolic adaptation signals kick in after about 3 to 4 weeks, I believe he said, which tells me, well, why don't we do a study where people are dieting for 8 to 12 weeks and then taking 4 to 8 weeks off for a diet break and then repeating, right? So in that sense, duration is halfway, frequency is halfway, intensity is halfway, right? It just can't be all on the whole time. And unfortunately, that's, a lot of people, that's what they do. They're either just dieting forever, all the time, barely, or they're dieting super hard every so often. And either way, it kind of ends in burning the candle at both ends.
Yeah, for sure. Do you feel like someone like outside of, a bodybuilder or kind of an elite athlete, what have you seen like in your coaching practice to be the most successful in terms of, like fast fat loss or slow fat loss in that regard with the frequency versus duration or intensity versus duration? Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a gray area. It's that middle ground, because if we look at research, it's usually slow, sustainable weight loss typically does the best at maintaining health, maintaining muscle tissue. The problem with slow diets is that it's psychologically taxing for a lot of people. They just like, are we here yet? They hire you and it's a payment for them. So they're like, give me something. I want to get results ASAP. So that's where it gets hard. And so what I've found to be very successful is typically that moderate frequency and intensity, and duration is, I guess, in the moderate too, because we might be doing it for 6 months, but we might be taking 3, 4, maybe even up to 6 weeks of a decent diet where I want to see you losing some weight every single week. You're feeling it, you're seeing the results, you're happy. And then you get to that end of that 4, 5, 6th week and you're like, I'm fine. My biofeedback's good. I can keep going. But I'm like, nope, we're going to put you in a diet break anyway, because I'm going to be proactive instead of reactive and give you a diet break. When you start binging, I'm going to do this now before you even get to that point where you're like, screw the diet. I'm done. I'm stressed. I'm tired. Diet fatigue is through the roof. That tends to be the sweet spot for me. The difficult part is always the buy-in, and this is why, and this because you do really well with content. This is why it's so important for coaches to put out content. It's not always just to get leads. It's also to educate your current clients, because they listen, and all of my coaches' clients, they listen and they watch and they hear what we're talking about and why we're talking about it. And that gives that buy-in. So when we say it's going to take a little bit longer than you want, but we're going to do it because it's the right way to do it, they buy into it, So I do like a little bit of intensity at the forefront, because I think they need to see that immediate small result just to keep motivation high. And then I like frequency and duration to be moderate.
Got it. Awesome. Okay. So I know we're kind of getting close on time here, and I have like 20 other questions I want to ask you. So I want to kind of just finish off with this one. In terms of cardio and conditioning and this topic, there's just so much information out there when it comes to, cardio, low intensity, high intensity, moderate intensity, just walking. But when it comes to just this like cardio and conditioning in general, can you just chat about like the importance of having, maybe we can just briefly go through like the ways that you would categorize cardio in a few different based off energy systems. You don't have to go deep into that, but just the way you would categorize them, and then why, it's important to work in those different energy systems, regardless of what your goal is, whether that is fat loss or even in a building phase, and why that's important for just kind of overall getting the result that you're looking for.
Yeah. I like to distinguish cardio and conditioning separately, and a lot of people don't. And I think this is kind of where you either work out or you train. You know what I mean? And to me, it's like training is intentional. It's purposeful. It's methodical. Working out is you're going to get in a sweat, which is great. You're doing that. Cardio to me is you're doing cardio, and I'll call it cardio if I want you walking for 30 minutes on a treadmill, because we're just trying to burn calories because you got a photo shoot coming up, and we're tracking those kind of things. Conditioning is a periodized cardiovascular training session, and we're utilizing the different energy systems. So the way I like to use these two is whether your goal is strength, muscle growth, fat loss, or just health, I'm probably going to put some kind of aerobic training regardless. if I can do more than one session per week of conditioning, like if you're lifting 4 days a week and conditioning twice a week, I'll throw in some anaerobic. And if you're really into sport or metabolic conditioning and you're trying to improve all the energy systems, we'll do some anaerobic alactic training. And I can kind of just briefly break down a little bit of the three, but aerobic training is cardio, right? That's where we're like sustaining it. And I really like OPEX does a good job of educating coaches on these systems, and they use sustain, gain, and pain, which I really like because aerobic training is sustainable. You should be at a heart rate and an intensity and an effort that is sustainable from minute 1 to minute 30 or 40 or however long it is. And you can do this by walking with a weight vest. You can do this by jogging. I'm not a huge fan of jogging, but you could do it by jogging. You could do it on the assault bike. You could do it in a mixed modal circuit, doing like the sled and then swings and then push-ups. And you're doing a rep or a time interval and you're just going at a moderate pace. Just 2 days ago, I had a session like this where it was assault bike, farmer's carry, jump rope, and rower. And it was 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off for 24 minutes. So 30 seconds every minute on the minute. And my goal is to be doing the same wattage or meters per minute, whatever I'm on, basically intensity from minute 1 to minute 24. Same exact intensity because it's a sustainable effort. This is going to be super important for health, longevity. It's great for your immune system. So in today's world, like it's probably something everybody should be doing in general. But it's also really good because it fuels your energy systems and it allows your body to recover quicker. So I think where this can come into play for muscle growth and strength training, which are the two categories where people are really just focused on building muscle or powerlifting strength, they usually skip out on this part. And the reason that's a mistake is because if we improve our aerobic system, we're improving our oxidative system and our ability to generate energy. And that means we can recover faster. So what used to take us 3 minutes between a back squat set might only take us 2 minutes, which also means if we still take 3 minutes, we're more likely to add more weight because now we're recovering quicker and faster. This also means that from Monday to Tuesday session, you recover faster. It means between each rep, you recover faster, which means that if you're doing a set of 10 to 15, you might actually be metabolically fatigued. And that's why you stop the set, not because your muscles are taxed. So if we want to build more muscle and we can limit our metabolic fatigue through a high rep set or a set of 20 rep squats, which we all know how miserable that is, we can get a lot more out of the muscle growth in the hypertrophy perspective. Now, it also burns calories. So obviously, if you want to lose fat, you're going to burn calories in the process and it's health. So that is a plus for that as well. But for strength and muscle, I think the recoverability and the health perspective is just so important. And if we're doing it from like the outside of the jump rope, everything I just talked about in that circuit is non-eccentric loaded movements. So the assault bike is concentric only. Sled pushes or pulls are concentric only. Rower is concentric only. But the good thing about that is the eccentric breaks down the muscle tissue a little bit more. Typically, there's more force on a joint. So if we're running, every time we have that eccentric load on the joint, every step, we're placing tension on the knee, the hip, the ankle, can cause joint inflammation and wear and tear over time. This is why a lot of runners have injuries in their knees, ankles, Achilles, things like that. But if we're doing these kind of sessions between training to recover better from an oxidative perspective, we're also bringing blood flow to the joints and not breaking them down more, which helps us recover between sessions, right? Because blood flow is the best way. It's better than icing an injury, which a lot of studies and PTs are promoting now is like, hey, let's move the joint. Don't put ice on it and blunt the pain response. So it's really great for recovery. Anaerobic training is more like weightlifting and high intensity, right? Which you can think of. The reason I like this less for people lifting is because if you do a back squat for anywhere between 5 to 10 reps, you got a heavy load, you're probably squatting from anywhere from 10 to 30 seconds at max, and your heart rate goes through the roof. How is that different than an interval session? Right? You take 3 minutes in between. That's a high intensity interval session. So I like implementing aerobic because it's probably the energy system you're not training, right? It's not that I think aerobic's better than anaerobic. It's just that it's most likely what you're not training. But anaerobic training would be doing that same circuit, but now I'm going 10 seconds of work instead of 30 seconds. It's unsustainable, right? I can sustain it for 5 to 10 seconds, maybe 12 at max, and it's max power output. Anaerobic alactic is beneficial, but it's probably not needed for a lot of people. If you're a high level CrossFitter, it is because you can, kind of like beta alanine helps you shuttle lactic out of the muscle, right? Lactate out of the muscle quicker so you can keep going and delay fatigue and you can keep pushing the muscle to beyond points of exhaustion. It's the most unsustainable point of effort. It's taking that anaerobic 10-second burst and doing it for a minute straight, which sounds like it's unsustainable because it is. After you hit 10 seconds, you probably slowly decline. but it's pushing through that. That's why OPEX calls it pain, which I really like.
Yeah.
But it's there is some research to show there's a tie between lactate production and muscle growth and hypertrophy. So there might be some benefits there. And I also think there's a huge mental benefit. If you can grind on the assault bike for 40 to 60 seconds for an alactic set, I mean, you got mentally stronger from doing that. If you've ever, you've done it, you were in CrossFit, so you know what I'm talking about, but there is a grit perspective to it. And we do get some of that lactate benefit, but I don't think Gen Pop needs it nearly as much as aerobic or anaerobic training.
Yeah, for sure. Do you feel like people kind of overdo it a little bit more than with the anaerobic training, like kind of the high intensity and the interval? At least from what I see with clients that I work with, which are a lot of women, a lot of kind of, women who are just all about go, 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 recovery is just a foreign concept. Do you feel like you've noticed that in your coaching practice at all with women in particularly, just feeling that they just have to keep going and train 6 days a week, do, anaerobe sessions on top of lifting, on top of everything else? And is that something that you see a lot in your coaching practice?
Yeah, I think it is. I think the society in general is pretty, everything's faster, better, quicker, more convenient, high intensity anaerobic training, I can do 10 minutes instead of 30. Like, let's do it,
Yeah.
And I think some guys are like that. It's just unfortunately more acceptable for guys to put on weight and build muscle and stuff like that, which is just completely, it shouldn't be different. But I think to say that is we have more women we coach, and we see that differentiate of more women trying to lose weight and men trying to gain weight. That's why we see that discrepancy, but 100%. And I think the reality is like I said, you're already doing anaerobic training with your lifting, and that requires a lot of recovery. So let's do something that requires less recovery and actually promotes more recovery. And it's not as sympathetic, which is going to drive adrenaline and cortisol up, just like we talked about earlier. And that can be an issue, so I think that 100%, I think people typically go too far with it or do it too often. And it's hard because, even that circuit for 24 minutes at a sustainable pace, every single set, I wanted to go a little bit harder because I could, but I knew I had 16 minutes left. And I'm like, all right, well, I got to it requires a lot of patience. And then you're just sitting there thinking in your head, like, okay, like, talking, like if you have a gym partner, you can kind of talk, but you can't even really keep conversation to watch. Like, it requires a lot of patience, almost like meditation, which I enjoy now, but at first it was tough. But I think you hit the nail on the head. I think too many people prioritize the high intensity or the anaerobic stuff, and they don't focus on the aerobic because it's just not as sexy. It's not as cool.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think it like comes back to what you said about, just the education and putting out, content, putting out tons of, posts and podcasts that are educating people on, specifically what the benefits of recovery are. Cause I know for me, for a lot of the clients that I work with, it's like, we don't think about, the recovery side of things, which is really just the missing piece to the puzzle, right? For a lot of people. I know it was for me for years. So
Yeah.
awesome.
Your results are only as good as your recovery. Literally.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. Cool. So I have tons of other questions, but I want to respect your time. I always end with this one question. So is there anything in the past year that you've changed your mind about, and why?
I would probably say, we're talking about fitness.
It could be,
right?
no, it can be anything, anything at all.
Honestly, business, I would say, because I'm a very even person. Like, I'm not like intermittent fasting guy, but there's a lot of benefits to it. I'm not a keto guy, but so I'm always in the gray area. I feel like those. So I haven't really changed my opinion. There's no paradigm shifts in the last year, but with business, there has been for me. And I think it's this, even though I've read the book probably 5 or 6 times, The One Thing, that, I think that there's a lot of people who focus on too many things at once. And I think that was one of them. I heard a quote from Ed Milet that like struck a chord with me. And it's very money focused, which is not the reason I do what I do, because any person who starts in our career doesn't get into it to get rich. But, we get into it to impact people and do what we love for a living, which was train and diet. Right. But he said no multimillionaire CEO became that way from multiple businesses. They became a multimillionaire from one business and then diversified into other things. So if you're a jack of all trades, master of none, you're shooting yourself in the foot, basically. And I kind of stopped and looked at like what I was doing as far as, training and nutrition and business consulting and even content, and how much types of content and where I was spreading myself thin. what I was doing within my business versus delegating. And I kind of sat back and was like, I'm just doing too much shit, and it's I don't know if it was ego, control, I don't know, but I've delegated a lot. I've brought on new people to the business. I've removed things that we were selling, things I was offering, just as a way to free up my time to do more of my quote unquote one thing. And it's been the best thing I've ever done. Mentally, I feel better. The business is way healthier and growing faster because of it. And it was a huge epiphany. So I think for people listening, whether you own a business or not, it's just the one thing. Like, what is your one thing? Keep the goal and just focus on that one thing.
Yeah, I love that. I actually have that book right behind me. Great book. Definitely something that I am working on myself, continue to work on, especially, being in, the fitness nutrition industry. There's just so much information. There's so much that you want to share and educate people on. And it's just like, all right, we need to like take back a step and really focus on, like you said, the one thing. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love that. Awesome. Do you want to tell our viewers or listeners where they can find you, or anything that you have coming up that you're excited about?
Yeah. I mean, piggybacking off the one thing, we just coach. So there's nothing, we're not launching anything or doing anything special, just coaching like normal. But tailoredcoachingmethod.com is where you can find everything. We have a ton of, hundreds and hundreds of free articles, podcasts, videos, free guides, all kinds of stuff on there. Most of my content is posted on Instagram at Cody McBroom. And then the podcast is the Tailored Life Podcast, which you will hear Rachel on very soon. And that's where the majority of our stuff is.
Awesome. Love it. And anybody listening or viewing, definitely check out Cody's content. I mean, I've learned so much from you over the past, I don't even know how many years. And so you've been really a pioneer in just my ability to educate my clients as well. And so I thank you for that. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on. It's been a blast.
Awesome. All right. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of MetFlex and Chill. I hope you enjoyed it. It would be awesome if you could give the show 5 stars and leave a review on iTunes. We're trying to get placed in the top 100 health podcasts, and the 5-star ratings and reviews are what can help make that happen. I'll add step-by-step directions for leaving a review in the show notes. I know it's a big ask, but it really helps. Thanks again. See you next time.